Hello everyone and welcome to a new episode of F-Secure's podcast Cybersecurity Sauna. My name is Janne Kauhanen and I will be your sauna majuri and the host of this podcast. In this show we're bringing you expert views on the hottest topics in the InfoSec game from our corner up north. So welcome to all our listeners and be sure to follow us on Twitter at #CyberSauna. With the disclosure of the Meltdown and Spectre vulnerabilities at the beginning of the year, hardware security has come into focus. What are the special challenges of securing hardware versus software, and how do the two interplay? Today we're talking to Andrea Barisani, Head of Hardware Security at F-Secure, about his area of expertise securing consumer electronics but also airplanes and cars, and his thoughts on Meltdown and Spectre. Andrea, why don't we start with a little background about yourself?
So, hello, it's nice to be here and thank you for having me. So I've been working in computer security for the past 18 years. I started working on hardware very early on, before the term IoT was invented. So many years ago when we founded a company called InversePath, which has been acquired by F-Secure last year to bring our expertise into what is now called IoT and embedded systems, more in general hardware security within the company. So my background started with traditional security consulting, which then very quickly steered over more into electronics and embedded systems and so on. And I think this partly comes from the background of myself and my team in physics, which we study at university, and we kind of really like the aspect of semiconductors and electronics, and we took that into the other field that we liked, which was hacking and security. So basically this is where I'm coming from, and this is why we gained this expertise over the years.
So you drifted to hardware security from physics?
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
You know, when you do hacking, you kind of want to take that approach to pretty much everything, and when it comes to, let's say, the digital world, you quickly realize that you just don't have software, but there's also this world about, let's say, a little more physical stuff, where I don't mean about locks and things, but, you know, electronics, the things that power up the computers that you use. And when you dig down into the way things work, at the end of the day, you make this transition from software to hardware, because you have to know what your CPU does, how memory works, how buses works, what are the ports on your computer.
Let's talk about that, the distinction between hardware and software. Like, what's the distinction between the two? Where do you draw the line?
It's not a very precise line, so to speak, especially nowadays where pretty much software has a lot of power on the way hardware works. So we now see devices as a whole. Let us say that traditionally security has been mostly involved into securing software. So you would develop a program that would run on a computer or on a server, and security traditionally focused on making sure that whatever network communication is exposed by that piece of software is secure. But nowadays, we're becoming more into a world where having physical possession of a device is a threat on itself for the manufacturer of that device. So your threat model doesn't consist only of people connecting remotely to that device, but also people owning that device and wanting to extract secrets or intellectual property information from it and attacking it from all kinds of perspectives. So whether we're talking about a mobile phone that people want to jailbreak, or whether we're talking about a vehicle that people want to hack either remotely or by leveraging on a port which is exposed inside, or a router because maybe you have some kind of confidential protocol on it and you want to protect it, but at the same time you have a product which is disseminated over your users. So the concerns become a little different when we have to take into account on how the hardware protects your software or how it doesn't in most cases.
So hardware and software are two sides of the same coin in security, but do you think that your understanding of both these sides is like a help or a hindrance in your security assessments, for example? Is it something that gives you a wider perspective, or does it make you go off topic?
Nowadays, understanding what we call it, the convergence between hardware and software is absolutely paramount. As security professionals, we cannot ignore any longer the effects that software has with hardware and the other way around. Let's see, with the Rowhammer attacks that were published a few years ago. Those consisted of a fundamental property of the way memory works, which can be triggered by software, and it affects other pieces of software running on the same computer just because of the way memory works. Recently, we see with Meltdown and Spectre, those are also two kind of attacks that leverage on the way hardware works at a very low level. And these are very sophisticated attacks. But you don't need to go that far in order to understand how, let's say, a hardware-related security issue comes out. Let's say that you have a router or a phone or a device, and let's say that it has the most sophisticated software protection you could ever think of. If you can simply open that device and find the debugging port or some kind of access that gives you some kind of more intimate overview of the data that's being transferred, then all of your software or pure software security features will be completely bypassed. So when thinking in terms of security now, we cannot ignore the importance and the exposure of the attack surface, which is hardware related. Yeah. And with IoT, this is becoming increasingly important, as we all know.
Yeah, you mentioned Meltdown and Spectre already, but before we go deeper into those, I just want to understand, like, what are the special differentiating challenges in securing hardware as opposed to securing software?
From let's say testing point of view, the skill set are a little different. You need different kind of tools, different kind of techniques in order to test, let's say, the hardware attack surface which is exposed. In terms of protection, the challenges are several. The main one is that if you have a flaw or if you make, let's say, even a bad design decision in hardware, it is not something that you can easily patch like software. Ideally, you would have a software update process for whatever application or operating system you're pushing out. But if you have a fundamental hardware flaw, sometimes you can patch it by lower level firmware updates, like maybe you upgrade your BIOS, update your bootloader, or maybe you decide to configure your processor registers in a certain way at boot up. But if we're talking about an exposed port or the lack of, let's say, a specific cryptographic component on your board, then sometimes you need to recall a product.
Right,
and to make hardware changes which are very costly. Oversights in hardware security most of the times cannot be easy to patch. So the way we work, we always inspire our customers to involve us very early on in the process, even of designing the so-called bill of material for a product, where you decide which components are going to be present on your device or not, how ports are going to be laid out, what's going to be the amount of interfaces that you're going to expose, and how you're going to configure them. Sometimes even the selection of the application processor that you have on a device such as a router can have a very critical impact in your security posture for that device. And of course, the challenge there lies into make sure that this process interacts with the actual functional development of the device, which usually it's the first concern for customers. Sure. And given that when you deal with hardware, you have deadlines, you have production schedules. I mean, when you manufacture something, there are a whole lot of challenges which you simply don't have when creating software. This becomes a very tricky exercise.
Yeah, like what you were saying about like how sometimes it's not that easy or cost efficient to fix hardware problems. I remember a couple of papers, even like we've published in the recent years, where basically the mitigation strategy for the end user was like, don't use this device ever again.
Yes, or replace it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's harsh.
Yes. And the thing is, if you're an attacker on a hardware device, your attacks cannot be throttled or filtered.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
If I expose to you a web server and I know he has some flaws, and I know about them, I can decide to put a filter to patch my software or to throttle you down. I can slow down your attempts into breaching my application. If I give you a device because you bought it, because you are the owner, you are free to attack it for as long as you want.
Absolutely.
And to buy as many devices as you want.
Yeah, and also like even if there is a fix, it's going to take years and years for everybody to replace their device, because you can't just like roll out the patch like you would in software.
Yeah, I mean, things are getting a little better. I guess in automotive, they're making some progress there. But it used to be that if you would buy a vehicle with, let's say, a fairly smart, in quote, infotainment system, you would be stuck with the same firmware for at least 5 years. So the cycle in software replacement in automotive is really, really long. Of course, it used to be that the exposure to remote attacks and also the relevance of attacks on these kind of equipment in automotive used to be of a very minimal risk. But now that they're becoming more and more connected, this changes. And this industry is kind of updating their whole posture in security, because they're really racing fast into becoming connected and providing more features. And security is becoming a concern. So it's a learning exercise for everyone.
Yeah, no, I get that. Like before I could hijack your radio and now I can hijack your brakes.
Yeah, exactly. So my team did one of the very first automotive attacks in history in 2007. So that was 11 years ago. And it was about leveraging on a data connection which was exposed over FM radio. And at the time, that was the only remote wireless data-driven attack surface that we had. And we attacked that. Now, of course, the impact wasn't that you could get on the brakes, right? And I remember that when we presented that talk, we advertised, I remember the final slide very well. It says, this is not the end of the world. However, this should be a warning for the future because maybe cars will be more connected. And now we're 11 years after that and we have self-driving cars. I can launch an app on my phone and I can locate my car in real time. So there's an extensive API for locating my vehicle and also getting sensor data from it. It's an industry which is really racing into having your car becoming more like your smartphone. And security has been lagging behind a little bit. And that's why we're very successful in helping our automotive customers in making sure that the entire attack surface of a vehicle is secure. And it's very challenging, but I think in the end, it's a very important work.
You mentioned Meltdown and Spectre. They got a lot of media attention. What is it about those attacks that makes them sort of different from conventional vulnerabilities, and how are they relevant for you?
Meltdown and Spectre are attacks which expose a fundamental flaw in the way memory addressing works on modern CPUs. And they leverage on the fact that features that are there for performance reasons lead to a break of expectations from a security standpoint. So this means that from a security standpoint, you expect the CPU to execute instructions in a certain order, but the CPU doesn't do that because of performance reasons. Now, this is fine. However, this aspect in combination with the opportunity of doing side channel attacks, which allows you to extract data indirectly, it meant that these flaws allowed to completely bypass a very specific and a very hard, or supposed to be hard, boundary in memory protection. From a user perspective, ideally, users wouldn't need to know about the fine details of these vulnerabilities and whether they're hardware or software, because ideally you get a patch and the patch solves the problem for you. What was important about these vulnerabilities is other than, let's say, elegance in the way they are one of the most beautiful issues that I've ever seen. Meltdown has been a very close call because we are lucky about the fact that it can be mitigated with operating system changes. There are very intrusive changes. They're very important changes, but we should be thankful that they can be made, that we can have mitigation strategies for Meltdown. Because if that would have not been the case, and this has been a very close call, it would have meant the end of cloud computing as we know it. Because it would have been impossible to enforce the memory separation between virtual machine instances on shared hardware.
Right. I mean, we have vulnerabilities before that allowed attackers to read memory, but you're saying the difference in this one is that we came so close to this being an unfixable problem.
Yes, traditional vulnerabilities that allow you to bypass guest segregation usually entail leveraging on a bug in the hypervisor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's say the hypervisor exposes you a driver which is buggy, and then you can use that interaction between the guest and the host to compromise the hypervisor and then, of course, read memory of other guests. This is kind of a more traditional vulnerability and something that you patch the hypervisor and you're done. But when you have a problem in the CPU and in the way lower level memory separation is handled, you gotta consider yourself lucky if the OS can do something about it, because you're dealing with a very direct interaction between your software and the CPU, because all softwares at some point, they deal with the CPU directly in order to do their work. And you rely on the fact that the CPU can contain memory access or register access for your application. Sure. If that falls apart, there's a risk that it does so in a way that the OS cannot do anything about it. But with Meltdown, luckily, this has been possible.
How visible is it to a person using like a virtualized host? If all my virtual computers are running on the same physical hardware, like, do I even know who else is on that same hardware?
No, you don't.
So there's no way for me to sort of guess if I'm being jeopardized right now or not?
No, but however, I think you should always make the assumption that your hardware is shared with somebody else. And it's important here to ensure that your cloud provider had a clear policy and strategy into patching these kind of things.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why between the discovery of these issues and their release, there's a long coordination between affected vendors to make sure that they're ready when this comes out. Now, this coordination has not been ideal for many reasons because it's been very complicated. But nonetheless, I think it has been effective for major cloud providers into implementing mitigation strategies. But it has been a very big deal because this issue has been somehow rediscovered before the official release, because the speculation about the speculative attacks, that's the term of the performance feature that enabled these attacks, so no pun intended, but the speculation about these kind of attacks led to other people creating proof of concepts just by being aware of the fact that an issue was present in that area. So people decided to investigate further, and this issue was rediscovered right before the official disclosure. And once you discover that, the time to a full working weaponized proof of concept has been very, very quick, because the actual payload, let us say, to exploit this is not that long, is not very difficult from a programming perspective. It's difficult from a conceptual level because you need to know what to program. But once you have it, it's very easy to use. And the kind of exploit for Meltdown means that if you are on a virtual machine, you can dump the entire memory of that computer. Meaning that if you have a, let's say, broker Bitcoin mining on another instance, you can completely compromise the data. You can read the data that this machine is processing.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't heard of any examples of like exploits being in the wild, but you wouldn't be surprised if they were.
Well, there is a tendency in the industry when an issue is found to say we're not aware of any exploitation in the wild. Absolutely. And this is a very, let's say, comforting phrase to say. You know, I'm a big vendor. There's an exploit out there. The first thing that I'm gonna say, oh yes, there's no evidence of this being exploited. So you have to be careful with these statements because they might be true, but also might be not. The fact that there's no evidence doesn't mean that you're not at risk. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you have the certainty that this hasn't happened before.
Yeah, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yes. So in security, we always apply the principle of conservative security, which means that we assume the worst.
Yeah.
And this is also why when we found a vulnerability, it is critical to release it as soon as possible, because we always have to assume that if we were able to identify that, we haven't been the only ones into finding that. And with Meltdown and Spectre, the proof of that is that different independent groups found it. And then luckily they coordinated among themselves. So yeah, this is absolutely important. It happened to us during the course of hardware security assessment for smart cards. So we're testing a smart card and we found an issue during the penetration test of this device. And we found it. We were waiting to finalize the report draft, and in 24 hours between us finding the issue and before giving the report to the customer, somebody else found the same issue and released it. And of course, this was a pure coincidence, but it just tells you that people are looking into this stuff all the time. And so it's a major concern.
So, okay, let's say somebody finds a critical vulnerability in the hardware I'm using, but I'm a company just manufacturing this hardware device and my components are made by different third-party manufacturers. So how do I even know like how good those are? How do I ensure that my product is secure when it's not entirely in my own control?
This is a very good question, and it raises a very valid point. One of the concerns when you're making hardware is that while you're in control of your own product, you are not in control of every single component that you're using on your board. In fact, most of the components that you're using, they're not manufactured by you. They're just bought by someone else. And of course, most of them have no security impact, but some of them can have a security impact. So one of the things that we're involved in is not only the selection process to advise whether to favor a specific classes of components or to ask for a specific set of features, but also to do penetration testing, security auditing of components that are third party, which are being used by a specific vendor within their product. And this is because most of the times the vendor itself doesn't really receive too much information about the components that they're using within their product. And so they want to make sure that the components are behaving as expected, that there are no surprises, that there are no backdoors, that there are no bugs which affect the operation of their final business goal for that device. And this is a challenge. So sometimes there are very good collaborations between the vendor and their suppliers. And sometimes there's really no transparency in the process. And so it becomes really difficult. And so the vendor itself has to do penetration testing of the components that they're using.
But is it ever possible to get that completely right? Because like if the attackers can get lower in the technology stack than you, then don't they like always win?
No, you can get this right by ensuring that you have a process where, so first of all, you either demand very specific requirements by your suppliers, or you establish this process where you do reasonable testing, because not everything can be tested.
Absolutely.
Or doesn't make sense to test everything from a time and budget standpoint. But you can take reasonable steps to ensure that, let's say, there are no surprises in the components that you're using and in the way you're integrating them among themselves. So if you're making a router, an avionics component, or some automotive equipment, usually what we do, we make sure that the security features that are needed to support the way the firmware works are there, and to ensure that they behave correctly. So we try to abuse them, we fuzz them, we creatively do testing in order to make sure that they behave as expected. And this gives confidence to the vendor about the fact that they have somewhat solid foundation, hardware foundation for the software that they want to run. And we help them in a process that usually they don't have the time or the expertise in doing, because they want to focus on make sure that, of course, their firmware runs efficiently without performance losses, and that it has all the features that it needs to have. So I think it's kind of a very good collaboration, and it kind of mitigates this unideal setting where you might be in control 100% or 90% of the software that you're running on your hardware, but not on the hardware itself. And yes, the way you tackle this is by doing extensive testing. And this becomes more critical when you also need to protect your intellectual property. So sometimes security testing is done not so much on the aspect of making sure nobody can compromise the operation of your firmware, but to make sure that nobody can extract it, because you don't want people to make clone copies of your hardware. We had a lot of cases where we had, let's say, this industrial cloning of entire classes of products. And we had companies that got their IP stolen, both from a, let's say, mechanical perspective. So people would replicate the mechanical operation of their devices, but also clone the firmware. Because the firmware had, let's say, the peculiar protocols that would make the mechanics work efficiently, so to speak. That's also a concern. And for that is also paramount to ensure that the hardware is effective in protecting your IP. But the protection is enforced by hardware means which, unless they're tested, you have no guarantee.
But if we're talking about the more traditional side of just making sure that the hardware is secure and people can use it and not be compromised through it, how good a job are companies doing in this right now? Like, can you give me an example of some products or industries that are doing good?
Usually, industry is always driven by the customer awareness or customer needs into the perception of security. And this is why certain areas are doing much better than the other. Look about mobile phones, for instance. Jailbreaking has been going on for a long time, and it's something that a lot of people know, even if they're not tech savvy. And there's an interest into certain companies to make sure that their devices cannot be jailbroken, because they don't want the customer experience to be less than ideal. Because maybe you jailbreak your device, something goes wrong, your phone becomes a brick, and you blame the manufacturer and not the jailbreaking process, because you're at the end you're an unhappy customer. So in that area, certain vendors have really advanced tech in order to prevent from this. In other industries like industrial control systems, we still have a lot of devices which are on factory assembly lines, which basically have either no security or security from the 70s, as we would call it. So very basic security, and they're really lagging behind. And this is because usually their customers didn't have either an awareness or a demand for security, because there are also customers that are into machining products, into creating things, and which are not necessarily IT or cyber related things. And so there hasn't been a lot of demand for that. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there's no need for security into these areas. And we see it happening in the past years that the security community is raising awareness about these kind of areas, is telling to the industry, if you are connected into any way, you're going to be vulnerable. And so things are changing, but they're changing at a slower pace compared to, let's say, mobile apps or other industries. And automotive has been really poor in security until very recently, and now they are ramping up. We work a lot with automotive customers.
No, I know. Aviation and automotive security both are like passions of yours. So they're both obviously high-risk areas, and it's easy to imagine all sorts of things going wrong there. But what are the challenges that you think need to be addressed in that area? How are they different from securing traditional IT infrastructures?
When it comes to safety, failure is not an option.
Right.
Which means that there's an extensive process to ensure that safety critical components behave as intended. However, the understanding of the interaction between security and safety is something which is a fairly new topic. In combination with the fact that the development processes and the certification processes for safety-related equipment tend to be really long, pose a challenge. In the aviation domain, if you want to make a change to running firmware or software, this most of the times affects the certification process, and it's really difficult to make changes after you certify something. So you really need to make sure that during the development process you test not only for safety but also for security where it matters. And this is where we are involved into ensuring that safety testing goes in parallel with security testing.
Right.
In the automotive sector, the life cycles are a little faster than in aviation because, of course, we see new model of cars coming out every 6 months opposed to new aircraft programs rolling every 5 years or even longer than that. But still, again, as I said before, these are dramatically different times, different outlooks from a time perspective compared to, let's say, updating the mobile app on your phone.
Yeah.
So the challenge is there to make sure that the logistics in the interaction between security testing and production, that they are in harmony together.
Yeah.
And that you don't arrive too late when you have a finding. If we have findings, but it is too difficult and too expensive to fix them because a vehicle has already been produced, because update processes are not ideal, then of course it's a little bit of a wasted work. So the biggest challenge there is to make sure that we correctly respect and interact with all the safety-related processes, which have been established for a very long time, have a long-standing tradition, and they're doing things which are, I think, really impressive.
Yeah.
Actually, one of my points is that security should learn a lot from the safety culture. It's also the other way around. We have a tendency in security that when, let's say, a security feature fails, we have a cryptographic library and there's a bug in it, they don't tend to fail closed, they fail open, and meaning that we have bug and data is compromised. We don't have the culture of failure is not an option in traditional software security. So,
Sure.
And this is one of the things that it's tricky to understand, but it plays great value when dealing with this kind of safety-related hardware assessments.
Yeah, I think we should think about more about the distinction between the two. For example, in Finnish, my native language, safety and security are the same word. So maybe that fact like limits people from thinking them as separate issues, but they absolutely are, like you're saying. If we're talking about automotive security, aviation security in general, is a security problem like automatically and immediately a safety problem as well?
No, it's not. And it's part of our assessment strategy to work with the safety teams and to understand the interactions and to identify the specific data flows that can affect safety. Because it's inconceivable to test everything, and it's also a waste of time and money. There's only very specific components which can have a safety impact. Depending on the way your systems are designed and laid out, you might have more exposure or less exposure. So if you have an infotainment system on a vehicle, and this infotainment system sits on the same bus, which allows to control the rest of the vehicle, then of course, everything that's connected to that infotainment system is a potential path to safety-related issues. If your infotainment system has Bluetooth, has USB ports, has Wi-Fi, has cellular connectivity, and it has no built-in layering, so that it means that if you compromise that infotainment unit, you are on the bus, then of course it's a major problem. However, when we're involving into the design process of these devices, we help designing ways that would allow you to have compartments. So that if your infotainment system is fully compromised, you have one more hardware barrier which prevents you from having full access on your system. So you won't become, let's say, the administrator of the car if you compromise that.
No, absolutely. I've that's one thing. Like when I hear about these hardware hacks on like vehicles, I've never understood why the radio should have control over the brakes.
Well, traditionally, this was the most efficient way of doing things, but this is slowly changing. So it really depends. In aviation, there are many layers, many doors that you have to go through in order to reach controls. And this also means that only very specific things needs to be tested, and only very specific security things have interaction with safety.
You just need to know which ones.
Yes, you need to know which ones, and the ones that might have an impact are tested to a great extent. This is to say that if the infotainment system of an airplane is compromised, it doesn't absolutely mean that you're going to have a safety impact. Usually it's quite the opposite. This, of course, doesn't mean that you should leave them open, because then you have also commercial risk and the perception of the passengers and so on. But however, it does mean that there are other layers of separation, and that the primary focus of security assessment go somewhere else. And this kind of scoping, we call it, where we understand what to look and where to look it can happen with pretty much every device, whether we're talking about a phone, a router, a car, a washing machine, an industrial control system. We always start by understanding what makes sense to test and what does not. And sometimes we have very quick or easy identification of our targets, and sometimes the design of the product means that we should test pretty much everything. It really changes a lot. But part of our expertise is specifically into this process. Scoping is really important. And I would say it's almost half of the job when you do a security assessment. And sometimes you even find issues just by scoping. You see immediately that there are some design flaws that needs to be addressed. It's a very creative process where your know-how and experience can help you a lot. And I think it's a key part of the work that we do.
Okay. So if there was one thing you wish like all hardware manufacturers woke up thinking, one piece of advice you could give them, what would that be to make the world just a little bit safer and more secure?
When we are involved early on into the design process, you can have the most impact into make sure that you have the right design decisions, and you can have the most impact into making sure that you mitigate and you contain problems that you might have, and you can build in security redundancies if you're keen to do so. And this also happens to be a more cost-effective process, because when we pen test a device and we found issues, then we have to go back and to repeat this process. If we can do this process early on, we're going to mitigate a lot of classes of issues right away. So the advice is to think of security for your embedded devices, hardware devices, whatever they might be, when you're designing them. And to involve a third party. It's going to be more cost effective for you, and it's going to have the most impact on the design of your product.
Yeah, I mean, this is true for software security as well, but more so on hardware security because of the cost of replacing and fixing the mistakes.
Yes, I would say that for software, it holds true ideally, but sometimes it might be a little bit difficult because, you know, when you're developing a piece of software at the very beginning, you might not know which language you're going to use.
Absolutely.
What kind of developers you're going to get, what's going to be their style of programming. And sometimes it's much easier to detect patterns and anti-patterns later on or into mid-development. But with hardware, some decisions start from selecting your bill of materials. It's kind of the equivalent of deciding whether to use C or a higher level language when developing your application. Right there, you're probably going to mitigate a lot of errors. Maybe they're going to still be there, but their impact is going to be much less just because you're going to using a higher level language opposed to C.
Yeah, or a specific framework or something.
Yeah, and I can think of a handful of critical design decisions when you're creating a software, but when you make hardware, they have a deeper impact, especially because you cannot patch them later. So my advice would be involve security professionals early on if you think your embedded product has any security impact for users. And these days, you know, it's gonna have.
Yeah, okay. So what is the direction you think hardware security needs to go in the future? Are there any initiatives you are working on to help it get there?
The work we're doing has the side effect of educating our customers into the process of securing a device. I think they learn a lot and they apply the processes that we inspire into the manufacture of their next products. What I see is in the future is that this convergence process that we have between software and hardware will speed up, and these concerns will be addressed hopefully more efficiently. But I also see legislation stepping into ensuring that we have strong requirements for IoT devices and safety critical devices into the so-called cybersecurity arena. I think a few years from now, there will be more responsibility and more penalties if you would be a vendor that releases an IoT device, which then is broken, cannot be easily updated, and allows customer data to be compromised in a very quickly fashion, as we know with IoT devices. Yeah. So I think legislation also will play a role. Of course, we're tech security consultants, so legislation is always tricky. When done right, it can be of a massive support. When slightly out of tune, it can hinder the whole process because it is seen more of a burden as something that supports you. It's a very difficult area, and there's a tendency for highly technical security consultants or engineers to not being such an expert in legislation, and rightly so, because it's not our domain. It should be approached with great care. But one of the initiatives that we're doing is that we work closely with lawmakers to make sure that they understand the needs and the processes which are involved into practically securing a device, so that we make sure that legislations and requirements are aligned with this process, that demands that will be made will be reasonable, be correct, and not something which in the end provides fake security and doesn't necessarily reflect to the actual security of the device, which is what unfortunately has been happening in the past years. So I think that's also a big area of improvement.
So what's the most interesting thing you've encountered when testing a piece of hardware?
It's kind of a tricky question because we have a lot of war stories and it's always impossible to give details because, of course, it's paramount to protect the confidentiality of our work and to protect our customers. However, I can say this, in some cases, your work, it is not only extremely challenging and extremely high tech in the way you test things and in the findings that you have. But there are some cases where the findings have a really deep and practical impact with the safety of people's lives. And there have been cases where what we found could have been potentially used to really create major safety issues. And when that happens, it means that you also have major liability issues. Sure. Because even if the issue is very complicated to exploit and needs a lot of information, just the fact that it's there becomes a liability for a company. And when this process happens earlier, in a stage where you can fix it and you can patch it, we feel that our contribution really has an effect. And it's not just pointing the finger at something, but it's really helping our customers to improve their products. And when this happens, I think it is the most interesting and rewarding things for us because we combine the technical expertise, highly complex exploitation with actual results that have safety impact. And we also get the customer to understand those and to fix them. And this is what we like. We like to see our findings fixed. Absolutely. We don't like to see our findings go reported and then, oh, this is too complicated to fix because we think then it's a failure for all the parties involved. And so when this happens, it becomes the most interesting thing to us. And we have a few cases of this. And of course, we cannot mention what the bugs were, or we cannot mention how you would exploit them and what you could achieve. But these have been, for us, the most interesting cases. And we were so relieved when we could see that they could have been fixed in due time.
Yeah, not just saving money, but saving lives as well.
Yes. Well,
all right.
Yeah, I don't want to be overly dramatic. We're not doctors or something. But, you know, as far as cybersecurity goes, I think it's one of the coolest things. And then, of course, when you get to be in an airplane or a car or into a factory or, you know, in these kind of environments, it's always a pretty cool thing.
All right. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for coming and thank you for sharing your expertise with us and our listeners.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great time.
That was the show today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please get in touch with us through Twitter with the hashtag Cybersauna with your feedback, comments, and suggestions. Thanks for listening, and be sure to subscribe.